Well, the topic of the Nephilim is hardly one that even needs introduction at this point. I mean, if you're watching the kinds of videos like the ones on my channel here, then you're almost certainly already very familiar with it. It's really over the past decade or two, the subject has grown exponentially in its popularity, both within the circles of Bible prophecy and even in secular venues such as things like the Ancient Aliens program or the recent Noah movie, both of which definitely portray the Nephilim from a perspective quite at odds with the biblical narrative there. The resurgence of this belief in the Nephilim and the interpretation of Genesis 6 is still really a fairly new phenomenon, even while it now borders on the edge of being a more mainstream concept. While being far less of a fringe concept than it was only a few decades back, we can see that for centuries, indeed for what appears to be the majority of church history, it had essentially faded into the status of forgotten myth and legend until folks like Chuck Missler started writing about it and reintroducing the possibility that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were in fact fallen angels who came down and mated with human women, creating giant hybrid offspring. The reason I find this point interesting is that when juxtaposed against the even more recent and more rapidly expanding topic of a flat and enclosed cosmology, is because I honestly still find it very puzzling as to why so many of these Bible prophecy teachers and speakers who have become advocates of the whole Genesis 6 paradigm seem to still remain so close to even investigating the flat earth concept. And now, aside from people like Rob Skiba, Zen Garcia, and a handful of others, the vast majority of these well-known Nephilim researchers still seem more or less content to ignore the flat earth phenomenon altogether, essentially dismissing it at first glance as some kind of obvious satanically inspired deception. And I really just find this to be incredibly ironic, the more you really stop and compare and contrast the two concepts alongside one another. I've already touched upon this issue a little bit as it relates to the Book of Enoch in a video called The Book of Enoch, Truthers and Questioning the Globe, and we'll get into a little bit more about Enoch in a minute, but first I just want to point out a number of other aspects of this comparison that really stand out to me. I'd say that the question as to whether or not the flat earth idea is ultimately just a deception or a psyop is actually a valid one. But it's a question that has to be tested and vetted, not just simply assumed as a knee-jerk reaction. And it's a question that should honestly be applied to not just the flat earth, but to the Nephilim as well. When I first heard about the Nephilim idea, it was through the author and speaker Tom Horn, and incidentally it happened right as I was first being exposed to the truth about 9/11, being an inside job, and the entire New World Order system. So naturally I was very suspicious as to whether or not this Nephilim concept might indeed be a false teaching designed to confuse people and corrupt a proper understanding of Bible prophecy. But as I went back myself and reread what it says in Genesis 6, and I found that indeed I couldn't accept the logical fallacy of the so-called Sethite theory, and I just saw how this explanation really did fit so much better with several other somewhat obscure passages of Scripture, such as those in Jude and elsewhere. However, when all is said and done, there really is only a handful of verses in the entire Bible that could even be said to have a connection to Genesis 6, and some of these are much more speculative than others, such as the famous "as in the days of Noah" reference found in Matthew 24. But even so, this relatively small amount of biblical evidence I found sufficient. Yet when you consider this in comparison to the vastly larger amount of verses which very much do speak to the idea that the earth is fixed and immovable with a literal solid firmament over it, if only you allow such verses to be interpreted literally, then you start to realize that the Bible actually makes a much more resounding case for the flat earth model than it even does for the Nephilim. And when it comes to the Nephilim, the detractors will basically rely on two main proof texts, those being the contrived Sethite theory as applied to Genesis 6, which I mentioned, and then the passage in Matthew 22, which says that the angels do not marry. It's really a very weak rebuttal of the Nephilim doctrine when you simply stop and point out the fact that, yes, angels were not created to marry, and this is why what the fallen watchers did was such a horrible act of rebellion against the created order. But really, I see the exact same sort of weak proof texting being used against the flat earth with verses like Isaiah 40:22. It's thrown around like it's this undeniable pronouncement of a spherical Earth. Yet again, closer examination and reflection reveals this to be a very poor argument. But what about the other types of arguments we hear so often? Again and again, I hear people scoffing at the idea that the Luciferian New World Order elites would create such a massive hoax as to fake the existence of things like moon landings or outer space in general. Yet when it comes to the Nephilim issue, scores of people will seem to have no problem accepting the possibility that government agencies such as the Smithsonian have been collecting and hiding the skeletons of giants for over 100 years, maybe 200 years. Or that deep underground military bases could be housing black op human-alien hybrid programs, things like this. Other Nephilim advocates will laugh at the idea of flat Earth because of how it flies in the face of so much, quote, established modern scientific knowledge, and so it must be absurd. Yet again, I'd have to ask, you don't think your belief in the existence of sentient spiritual beings called angels is contrary to modern scientific consensus? Not to mention the idea that these angelic beings were also able to descend and manifest themselves into a physical state, whereby they were able to mix their angel DNA with that of humans, creating massive giant offspring, all in an antediluvian world where these fallen watchers were bestowing sinful mankind with all sorts of forbidden occult technology? Yeah, sure, that doesn't challenge the norms of modern scientific belief at all. If anything, it has plenty of commonalities with the false Gnostic doctrines embedded in the whole ancient aliens narrative. Does this mean that the Nephilim must be nothing more than a psyop planted by occult sources? And then, of course, we have the Book of Enoch, which Christian Nephilim researchers like L.A. Marzulli have been referring to as the extra-canonical, biblically endorsed text for years now, because of all that it has to say about the rebellion of the Watchers and their Nephilim children and everything else. But man, when you step back and read through the entirety of 1st Enoch, you'll certainly begin to realize that the sins of the Watchers comprise only a pretty minor portion of everything else it has to say. The bulk of this biblically endorsed text actually talks at length about the enclosed cosmology involving the circuits of the sun, moon, and stars over a stationary Earth with fixed boundaries, and the throne of God being literally on top of everything. And so as I reflect on all these comparisons as a whole, the only word I really find appropriate to describe the mindset which entertains the Nephilim paradigm, yet refuses to even give the flat Earth the time of day, is simply hypocrisy. I mean, either go back to the mainline conformist approach to everything in the Bible, which has dominated church doctrine throughout the modern era, or apply the same standards of investigation towards the flat Earth cosmology as you have towards the Nephilim. As simple as that. Because truly, the two topics are really far more interconnected and similar in terms of them both having cosmological implications that could play into the whole end-time deception scenario than a lot of people realize. After all, the whole reason as to why the Nephilim topic is of any real importance for us to study in the first place isn't because it's just so important to know exactly what happened before the flood. I mean, that chapter in history is over and done with anyhow. It's because of the realization that it might actually be possible for the enemy to corrupt humanity on a genetic level, which suddenly throws a whole new light upon all the questions regarding eschatology, such as the mark of the beast, or the creatures coming up out of the abyss, or the Antichrist himself. It adds a whole new dimension to what we have to consider as possibilities for how it all might unfold. And really, the question of cosmology as a whole is something that might apply in a lot of the same kinds of ways. I mean, it's easy to see how a realization of the Nephilim hybrids in Noah's day leads to a realization of how things in our own time, like genetic manipulation and transhumanism, could very well be leading up to some very sinister possibilities involving demonic agendas and the eventual establishment of the fully realized Antichrist kingdom. But the Nephilim narrative basically helps us to realize that a lot of the assumptions held for centuries by the Church about there being an absolutely unbreakable barrier between the earthly and spiritual realms might not be terribly accurate. A truly biblical examination of the flat Earth topic really leads to the same sorts of realizations, particularly when it comes to the question of the heavens, because really, we're essentially talking about that celestial abode from which those Watcher angels originally came from. I mean, did they come from outer space? From some distant planet in a faraway galaxy? Do you really not see how the heliocentric expanding universe is actually the model which lends itself far more towards painting the Nephilim in that ancient aliens light, instead of one which coincides with the Bible as a whole?